Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Hello and welcome. This is Real Britain with me, Darren Grimes, on telly, DAB and online. Today we'll be discussing public sector pay. The government's announced a pay rise for around 2.5 million public sector workers, but there are complaints that it isn't big enough. It's come down to Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak on who will be the next Prime Minister. We'll be getting the views of two disagreeing Tory councillors on who they think's best for the job. And there are rumours that Donald Trump will run again to be President of America in 2024. Have you missed him? I know I have. But before we get stuck into the show, here's the news with Tamsin Roberts.
Darren, thank you. Good afternoon. It's 1 minute past 2. Here's the latest from the GB newsroom. Drivers hoping to travel through the port of Dover are facing a second day of severe delays. The port authorities expressed relief at improved levels of French border staff, but warned there is a way to go to clear the backlog. The Foreign Secretary Liz Truss said the queues were unacceptable and called on officials to build up capacity at the border. A French politician claims the delays are a result of Brexit, as officials have to run more checks than before. But Dover MP Natalie Elphicke says the queues are down to the French side.
The French didn't turn up to work as they were expected to do in the numbers that were needed, and that resulted in that traffic gridlock in Dover and that traffic chaos that we saw right across Kent. So the French were responsible for the mess yesterday. I understand that they are now manning the passport controls properly at Dover, which is good news, but it will take some time yet to clear through that traffic backlog.
Rishi Sunak says he would put the UK on a crisis footing to tackle issues such as inflation if he becomes Prime Minister. Speaking in Grantham, the former Chancellor hit back at tax cuts announced by his rival Liz Truss, warning they could lead to further inflation. He also promised to tackle the NHS backlog, pledging to eliminate one-year waiting times by September 2024.
I'm the candidate in this contest who can say unequivocally the NHS will be safe in my hands. We face the worst NHS winter crisis in decades. Tackling the backlogs is the biggest public service emergency.
Meanwhile, Liz Truss is promising to review all EU laws, calling for a red tape bonfire of all legislation retained after Brexit if she becomes Prime Minister. The Tory leadership hopeful said she would implement a review by the end of next year and scrap rules which were deemed to hinder UK growth. She argues that the measures would encourage business investment, but critics warn it could lead to a weakening of workers' rights. The body of a man has been found in Essex this morning after a 21-year-old went missing on the hottest day in British history last week. Emergency services had been looking for a man who was last seen in the water on Tuesday, close to Clacton Pier. Police say formal identification of the body has not yet taken place, but efforts are being made to contact the man's family. Ukraine's infrastructure minister says his country will continue to prepare for grain exports despite today's Russian missile strike on the port of Odessa. Local military say the strike did not cause significant damage, but there are concerns it threatens a landmark deal between the two sides. The agreement would allow the export of grain from Ukraine, which is hoped will ease global food shortages. It follows months of Russia blockading Ukraine's ports in the Black Sea. Britain's Matthew Hudson-Smith has won a bronze medal in the 400 metres hurdles at the World Championships. He finished behind the USA's Michael Norman and Kirani James of Grenada. The 27-year-old revealed afterwards that he tried to take his own life last year whilst battling injuries which he described as absolute hell. His win takes Great Britain's medal tally to 4 in Oregon. A pizza delivery driver in the United States has been praised after rescuing 5 people from a burning home. Nick Bostic was driving in Lafayette in Indiana when he saw a burning house. He managed to help 4 people leave the building before going back in to rescue a 6-year-old girl. After finding the child, the pair had to jump from a first-floor window. Incredibly, they only sustained minor injuries. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens, of course. Now, though, it's back to Darren.
Welcome to Real Britain with me, Darren Grimes. Here's what's coming up on the show. Pay rises for millions of public sector workers were announced this week, but how many are unimpressed with the amounts offered by the government? We'll be debating why public sector workers should or shouldn't indeed get a bigger pay rise. We'll also be talking about private healthcare. More than 250,000 people paid for medical treatment last year to actually avoid long NHS waiting times. You had things like hip and knee replacements, which can cost up to £15,000 during, of course, the cost of living crisis. I don't know how many people can actually afford to go on like this. There are queues of cars at the port of Dover as officials warn that delays for people travelling to France over the weekend are likely to increase. Authorities in Kent have declared a major incident due to the traffic. Some are blaming Brexit as more checks are needed to pass through, but actually I would argue a lot of the blame lies on the French side. That's what we're talking about for the next hour. I would love to know your thoughts though. Are you stuck in traffic in Dover? Or if it's having an impact on you, I'd love your views. Tweet me at GBNews or email me on gbviews@gbnews.uk. You can watch us online on YouTube and don't forget Facebook. Loads of cracking content on our page. Cheers very much. Boy, oh boy, borderless Britain. It's fast becoming quite the ineffectual woke joke. Earlier this week, the Independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration announced that it found the Home Office's response to the English Channel ferry service to be ineffective and inefficient. David Neil was scathing about the Home Office's decision to delay his report, and we needn't be surprised, folks. I tell you what, given the Home Office's role in keeping us all safe, it's doing an absolutely appalling job when it comes to the essential functions of any nation state, that being the defence of its borders. Getting into Britain these days appears to be a doddle. You see, you can escape the baguettes, cheeses and wines of France to enjoy bed, board and benefits in a taxpayer-funded hotel here in Britain by throwing documents overboard before your arrival. According to a Home Office Freedom of Information request over 3 years, only 317 out of 16,500 had a passport while being processed here in the UK. Meanwhile, everyday Brits, of course, suffer the impact of a housing crisis, a healthcare crisis, a school places crisis, a dentist crisis, an energy crisis, a cost of living crisis, and on the list goes. And what's shocking to me, and believe me when I say you wouldn't hear this on other channels, but what's incredible is that time and time again, we have reminders of the threat of offering sanctuary to those who potentially don't wish us well. We know that the Manchester Arena bomber's father supported a Libyan jihadist group banned in the UK because of jihadi links. And yet, his father was offered a home here. His son went on to murder 22 people at an Ariana Grande concert. But of course, not everyone coming here wants to claim asylum, wants to do us harm. But I am absolutely saying that there is a fundamental problem with the checks and balances that don't seem to be working. Many are desperate to play a part in British life. I don't doubt that for a second. But it's undoubtedly alarming to read one section of this report that makes clear that 227 migrants had escaped from their taxpayer-funded hotels between September 2021 and January 2022. In one 5-week period alone, 57 migrants fled. 2/3 hadn't had their photographs or fingerprints taken. So that's 57 people over 5 weeks that we know next to nought about, traipsing around the streets of Britain unencumbered and up to God knows what. Now, of course, I repeat, not everyone coming here to claim asylum wants to do us harm. It is the fundamental point that these checks and balances are not there. The Times reports today that the British people have potentially been misled, or that the Home Office is so utterly incompetent that it didn't notice that the problems with its policy. We've been told that to combat these crossings, in what looks to be a record-breaking year, with over 15,000 migrants crossing the Channel as of July, as of this month, the Rwanda policy was supposed to deter migrants from making the crossing and from people paying people smugglers. Well, lefty lawyers and our membership of the European Court of Human Rights quickly put a stop to that. But even if it had worked, even if the whopping 120 million quid that we've sent to Rwanda had been effective, how many people could they have taken? All 15,000, you might ask. 1,000? No. The number is as low as 200. Yolanda Makolo, a Rwandan spokeswoman, despite the agreement signed in April, speaking of accepting thousands of people over 5 years, spokeswoman suggested that they currently only have capacity for 200 at one facility. So it just isn't going to work. Other measures include a drone. Get this, a drone that was released to monitor and deter the crossings, which was recently found in the sea by fishermen. You couldn't make it up. The gadget, the training, the parts and other facilities cost £420,000 of your money. That's the Sun, citing figures reported by Reuters, the news agency, actually said. If you ask me, folks, this is utterly farcical. It's like Carry On crossing the Channel. It's filled with so many areas of mismanagement that I'm half expecting, folks, to hear Sid James's laugh any minute now. And I'd be laughing now if it wasn't all so serious. Because we here, the British people, continue to be misled. And I really hope that the next government dedicates a cabinet position solely devoted to tackling the migration crisis, given the sheer scale of incompetence displayed by a government department that was supposed to seize the opportunities of Brexit in taking back control of our borders. The British people have had enough of utterly supine, spineless, simpering political leaders when it comes to issues of national security. Now, as I said at the top of the show, union bosses have described proposed pay increases for public sector workers as a kick in the teeth, saying it's actually a real terms pay cut due to high inflation. The General Secretary of the Unite union even went as far as to describe the pay rise as a betrayal. The increases will see some police officers getting as much as an 8.8% extra pay rise, with NHS staff getting at least 4.5% pay rise, teachers 5% and armed forces staff 3.5%. So are the unions right that public sector workers deserve an even higher pay rise? Or are their demands unreasonable during a time of high inflation when, let's not forget, a lot of people in the private sector are struggling? So to debate this, I'm joined by Joe Vendry, spokesman for the Taxpayers Alliance. I nearly misgendered you there, Joe. And John McTernan, political strategist and former director of political operations for Tony Blair. John, start off with you. Do public sector workers deserve a pay rise that's in line with inflation, which, as the unions have been saying, is generation defining in how high it is? But is it right at a time when, of course, people in the private sector are struggling too?
Well, private sector pay increases are on average around 7 to 8%. So if public sector workers got the same, they'd at least be level pegging with them. But I think the public sector pay settlements, this inflation comes, and this pay cut, because it's half of the inflation rate basically for most public sector workers, this pay cut comes after a decade of pressure downwards on public sector wages. And the consequence is the next item you're going to be discussing, or an item you're discussing later, which is massive NHS waiting lists. And there are massive staff shortages in the NHS. And the inability of the public sector to recruit to jobs should clearly be part of the consideration when giving a wage increase. Public sector wages only cover 14%, 15% of workers in the UK. So they're irrelevant in terms of inflation. They're relevant in terms of whether people are getting a pay cut. They're relevant in terms of whether you're recruiting enough people to critical public services. And it's absolutely clear that staff shortages are part of the catastrophic waiting list crisis in the NHS.
But John, isn't it the case, though, that if we start hiking public sector pay packets, the inflationary pressures that we're feeling right now are only going to be exacerbated?
How does a nurse's wage impact on inflation?
Well, it's not just the NHS. If it's across the entire public sector, there's a hell of a lot of people employed in the public sector.
Wage increase inflation.
Well,
explain to me how the wage of a police officer or a nurse increase inflation. It doesn't. They don't sell services.
So, Joe, there is absolutely nothing a matter with hiking public sector pay packets, says John.
Well, look, I certainly don't begrudge anyone for wanting to see more money in their pockets right now. You know, as we've discussed, inflation is sitting at 9.4%, and we're all contending with the cost of living crisis. But I think with that in mind, for union bosses to call these proposed rises a kick in the teeth is a bit outrageous. I mean, after all, it is hard-working taxpayers across both sectors who will ultimately be the ones footing the bill. And, I think as things stand, we know these pay rises have been offered and they will apparently come out of existing budgets, which hadn't factored in rises quite so big. So I think the onus now really falls onto these departments to tighten their belts and find that cash by cracking down on wasteful spending.
So, Joe, do you actually think we're in for a summer of discontent here? Do you think the unions are going to continue to make their demands? And actually, at this time, we've got a government that's in complete disarray. So they're going to get what they want, aren't they?
Well, it's certainly looking like we've got a summer of discontent ahead. But, what I would ask is, when it comes to the union's demands, what are they actually hoping to achieve? I mean, let's look at some of the things that they're demanding. You've got the British Medical Association calling for a 30% pay rise for doctors over the next 5 years. I mean, how do they actually expect that to be paid for? Let's not forget, recently, on top of everything, workers have had to endure a national insurance rise, supposedly to fix backlogs in the NHS. So I think unions need to really realise that everybody is struggling at the moment, and placing these enormous demands on normal, ordinary, hard-working taxpayers is just deeply unfair.
So, John, are you just asking the next generation to take on a tax burden so big that it'll almost be a weight around their necks for the rest of their working lives?
No, that's the most ludicrous argument that's ever made in this area. If we can get a Labour government back, we can get an economy that's growing, a productive economy, and the more the economy grows, the bigger the tax base, the bigger the ability to spend on public services. We're in this situation because under the Tories, we've had 10 years of lost growth in the 2010s, and we're well set on another 10 years of lost growth. Japan only had one lost decade. The Tories trying to beat that by giving Britain 2 lost decades. The country has a growing economy. The country can pay for things, and the people may or may not want the national insurance increase. It is hypothecated to pay for the NHS, and it seems to me it's really clear if you don't do something about pay in the NHS, then you will have vacancies. And when you have vacancies, nursing staff, cleaning staff, theatre staff, consultants, GPs, you're going to have a crisis in the NHS, and that has to be addressed at some point.
Joe, just last word to you.
Well, yes, I would actually agree with John there in terms of needing to go for growth. What we would absolutely like to see is workers across the board taking home more of their hard-earned money. And, by far the best way to do that is to cut their taxes. As we know, the country is dealing with a 70-year high tax burden, which needs to be addressed. And public sector workers are feeling the pinch as much as anyone else. So what we'd be saying is, let's cut income tax. Let's undo the April national insurance rise. Let's scrap green levies and lower VAT. I mean, these are things that are ultimately going to leave working people with more money in their pockets and see them through this crisis. And not only that, but it will actually give the country some room for some of that much-needed growth.
OK, folks, thank you very much to the two of you. That was Joe Ventry there from the Taxpayers Alliance, and before that, John McTurnan, the former political director of political operations even for Tony Blair. Thank you to the two of you. I'm joined in the studio by the political commentator Emma Webb. Emma, do you actually think do you have sympathy with these union bosses saying, look, my workers deserve a public sector pay increase?
I think Joe's right. I mean, anyone can have sympathy with people wanting to have more money in their bank account, for sure. But the fact that the union bosses are complaining that this is a kick in the teeth because they say because it's not in line with inflation that it's a real terms pay cut. Well, it's not as much as a real term pay cut as it would be if they didn't get this increase that they're already being offered. And the fact still stands that this money comes from the public purse. These are public sector workers. And that means that all of those people who are also suffering from the burden of the cost of living crisis, who are also suffering from inflation, who are not getting pay rises, are having to foot the bill. So if you really want to talk about fairness, you have to balance that pay rise, which I think in many cases, particularly in the case of nurses, I think nurses and police officers earn too little anyway. But you have to balance these things because this is public money. And unfortunately, Kemi Badenoch has now been knocked out of the leadership race. But this is a point that she made very well in her launch, the launch of her leadership speech, when she said that the government needs to spend money in the same way that individuals do. It needs to be careful that every single pound that is spent is value for money. And the problem is that at the moment in the public sector, we're not getting value for money. And I think that we need to be very responsible in how we choose to spend that money before we talk about giving them huge hikes and pay increases.
And one thing that Kemi said that I think really spoke to me, and it spoke to you, I know as well, was that she said politicians need to start being honest with people. She said politicians need to say we've got no money, right? We haven't got a pot to pee in as far as the nation's debt expenditure is concerned. And the fact of the matter is what I said at the very start of the show, as far as immigration's concerned. The government, politicians, even trade unions just aren't being honest with people about actually, one, the amount of money we can spend as a nation, two, the people coming here and the fact that mass migration is still ongoing. And there are so many ways in which the people out there, Emma, people watching this show now, are just sick to their back teeth of being lied to.
Completely. I think actually this is not just to do with the Conservative Party. This is why I, as a side point, think it's quite laughable to suggest that Labour would bring about more economic growth, because part of the problem is that the Conservatives have behaved like socialists by taxing everybody up to the eyeballs, and that damages growth. But I think that that you've touched on something important, which is that when the political class fail to communicate truthfully and honestly with the British public, it erodes trust, because it means that people's life experiences, their experiences of the unfairness of the fact that you have all of these people coming across the channel, essentially jumping the immigration queue ahead of people who may have more of a right to be here. Those people are taking up public services. They're being offered things like bespoke dentistry services when there are people around the country who have no access to a dentist. And there are people who fought, during the Second World War, who were having to sell their homes, and their families are having to take out loans and go into debt to pay for their care. So we see in everybody's life, we see all of these instances of what we regard as being a very, very unfair system, and the government has failed to communicate to people what their expectations can be, particularly over COVID with all of the public health policies. It seems that this has sent the message that there is some magic money tree and we can just keep funding from the public sector, and we call it, we talk about it as being government money, but it's not, it's ours.
Yeah, it's taxpayer cash. No such thing as government money. Emma Webb will be speaking to you again shortly. Now, folks, there's plenty more to come this afternoon on Real Britain. Next, we're going to be discussing the EU's latest legal action against Britain with Martin Howe QC. And is private healthcare set to become the new norm for patients? And if you're stuck in traffic in Dover, please do get in touch. You can tweet me at GBNews. But first, folks, let's have a look at the weather.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking wet across the north and west, but drier in the south and east. Let's take a look at the details. Scattered showers, which could be heavy at times, will move slowly eastwards across southwest England as we head through the evening. Breezy with temperatures around 18 or 19 Celsius. A fine evening to come across southeast England with plenty of sunny spells. Feeling warm and humid with temperatures up in the low to mid-20s. Often cloudy across southern Wales with outbreaks of rain moving through. The rain could be heavy at times too. Breezy with temperatures around 19 Celsius. Increasing amounts of cloud across the Midlands this evening. It should remain mostly dry, but a few showers may move in across the west later. Temperatures hovering around 21 Celsius with light winds. Rather cloudy this evening across northeast England with just the odd spot of light rain possible. This mainly falling over the higher ground. Rather humid with temperatures sat in the low 20s of Celsius. A mostly cloudy evening to come across much of southern Scotland. Outbreaks of rain will move through on a brisky southerly breeze with temperatures at 18 or 19 degrees Celsius. A cloudy evening for Northern Ireland with some heavy rain moving across the country. Rather breezy too along eastern coasts. Temperatures will range from 18 to 20 degrees Celsius. Outbreaks of rain will continue to move across the country as we head overnight, staying windy for western areas in particular. And that is how the weather is shaping up overnight into tomorrow morning.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know. The latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Unelected bureaucratic friends over there in Brussels, the EU Commission, have decided to take legal action against the United Kingdom. The Commission accused the UK of trying to overhaul the post-Brexit trade deal. This is in light of the British government introducing legislation aimed at ripping up post-Brexit trading rules for Northern Ireland that essentially have Northern Ireland in the single market and the jurisdiction of the European Court over it. This was an attempt to actually override the protocol part of the treaty. But the Prime Minister insists that this isn't breaking international law, as it's a necessity to restore power sharing of institutions in Northern Ireland. So what does the EU's legal action against the UK actually mean? Well, joining me to discuss, I can think of no one better, is Martin Howe QC. Martin, thank you very much for your time. Could you just explain where we stand on the Northern Ireland Protocol right now and why the UK's action has proved controversial in Brussels?
Well, the protocol has caused an enormous number of problems. People talk about it as being about trade rules. Now, partly it's about trade rules, but more importantly, it has big constitutional effects by causing Northern Ireland to be subject to a large number of European Union laws, and some of them very important indeed, like the laws on medicines, and causing Northern Ireland to be subject to the rulings of a foreign court, the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg. And this has undermined the union between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, contributed to the collapse of power sharing, undermining the working of the Good Friday Agreement. And quite apart from that, it's resulted in checks on trade, customs formalities, and so on trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland inside our own country. So action has to be taken to deal with it.
Yeah.
The government's bill, which Liz Truss promoted, has actually cleared the House of Commons last week. It's done all its stages in the House of Commons. So it's only the Lords to go through, there may be difficulties there, but eventually it will come through. And what it will allow, it's wrong to call it ripping up the protocol. What it will allow is introducing a sensible regime which facilitates trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, while at the same time preserving the European Union's legitimate interests in not having goods that haven't paid duties or goods that don't conform with their laws crossing the Irish land border into the Republic of Ireland.
Yes, because, Martin, a lot of people in Brussels would turn around and say, well, actually, in order to keep the single market intact, we can't allow a flooding of goods that haven't been checked and all the rest of it. But I find it utterly bizarre, that argument, Martin, that the vast majority of EU checks now take place at the border that's been created between part of our country and another part of our country. The United Kingdom isn't some kind of we don't have dodgy goods flooding people's borders every 2 minutes. This is just a complete farce and deliberate tactics to undermine Brexit, is it not?
Well, I think it is. It was imposed on us in a situation of great weakness when Boris Johnson, initially Theresa May and then Boris Johnson trying to sort of negotiate his way out with extreme difficulty, both from our Supreme Court and from Parliament, who the Remainer majority in Parliament, who passed a terrible bill which forced an extension of EU membership. And we have to remember this. Now, I think the protocol is completely unacceptable from the point of view of any independent state. No independent state can possibly tolerate having a foreign court, foreign officials, foreign laws in part of its territory. And on top of that, effectively foreign-controlled customs controls inside its territory, and in our case, between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And this has to go. At the other half of the equation, do you need checks on the Irish Sea, in the Irish Sea, or the Irish Sea ports to prevent goods going across the land border? No, you don't. This thing about customs posts on land borders is a complete fantasy. What do you get? You have a man with a peak cap and a pole across the road who might inspect 1 in 100 vehicles going through.
Okay.
It's a nonsense.
Yeah. Martin, whenever I hear Americans wax lyrical about how this is important for the peace process, as if the EU was a guardian of said peace process, but the fact of the matter is, it would be tantamount to an American state, a US state, finding that Canada was in charge of its regulatory affairs and its courts. It's just a complete ludicrous suggestion for a democratic nation state to be subject to a foreign power. But Martin Howe QC, I do thank you for your time and your expertise as ever. You're with GB News, folks, on telly and DAB radio. Next, we're going to be discussing private healthcare, the latest rise in inflation, and a possible ban on sunbeds. Do you like a 9-minute holiday? But first of all, it's time for a check on the news headlines with Tamsin Roberts.
Darren, thank you. Good afternoon. It's 2:33. Here's the latest from the GB newsroom. Drivers hoping to travel through the port of Dover are facing a second day of severe delays. The port authorities expressed relief at improved levels of French border staff, but warned there is a way to go to clear the backlog. The Foreign Secretary Liz Truss said the queues were unacceptable and called on officials to build up capacity at the border. A French politician claims the delays are a result of Brexit, as officials have to run more checks than before. Rishi Sunak says he would put the UK on a crisis footing to tackle issues such as inflation if he becomes Prime Minister. Speaking in Grantham, the former Chancellor hit back at tax cuts announced by his rival Liz Truss, warning they could lead to further inflation. He also promised to tackle the NHS backlog, pledging to eliminate one-year waiting times by September 2024. Meanwhile, Liz Truss is promising to review all EU laws, calling for a red tape bonfire of all legislation retained after Brexit if she becomes Prime Minister. The Tory leadership hopeful said she would implement a review by the end of next year and scrap rules which were deemed to hinder UK growth. She argues that the measures would encourage business investment, but critics warn it could lead to a weakening of workers' rights. President Zelensky says a missile strike which hit the port of Odessa shows that Russia will try to find ways not to implement the new grain export agreement, which was signed yesterday. The strike is not thought to have caused significant damage, but may destabilise the deal. The agreement would allow the export of grain from Ukraine, which is hoped will ease global food shortages. It follows months of Russia blockading Ukraine's ports in the Black Sea. TV, online and DAB Plus radio, this is GB News. Don't go anywhere. Darren will be back in just a moment.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Welcome back to Real Britain with me, Darren Grimes. Now, new statistics show that 250,000 people have jumped from the NHS and are now choosing to use private healthcare instead. That's because the NHS waiting lists are so long, with some operations being cancelled or delayed as hospitals try to cope with increased demand during the COVID pandemic. Now, it's these increasing waiting lists which have spurred some to actually seek out private healthcare, often for the first time, paying for operations and treatments out of their own pockets. Joining me to discuss this phenomenon is Christian Nimitz, Head of Political Economy at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Christian, thank you for your time. But given these record highs that the NHS are experiencing as far as waiting lists are concerned, is it any surprise to you that more and more people are turning to private healthcare? And actually, is it music to your ears? Because now, Christian, as I've just been discussing with Emma Webb during the break there, we see that there is no such thing as universal healthcare in the NHS, in Britain, as far as the NHS is concerned, because the access to it has to be rationed, doesn't it?
Yes, well, exactly. First of all, on your first question, no, I'm not remotely surprised that people are turning to private alternatives. If anything, I'm surprised that it took this long, because the situation really is dire. We now have more than 6.5 million people on waiting lists. A lot of them have been waiting for a very long time, and sometimes for quite debilitating conditions, things that need to be seen urgently. So at the moment, I guess this is the least bad outcome, that people, at least some people, find a private alternative. But the trouble is, this is something which creates the thing that a lot of people who are generally resistant to health reform have been warning about the whole time, namely a two-tier system. Now we're getting precisely that, because we're not reforming anything. So precisely the absence of meaningful reform is now creating the problem that we were always told meaningful reform would create.
Now, Christian, we're often told by those people that do say that we're creating a two-tier system, we're often told that actually the problem is the NHS is being starved of cash. Now, I know for a fact that you're about to tell me that the NHS is getting more money than ever before, but you know what, the Brexit promise was this £350 million a week for the NHS. It has had that and then some, hasn't it?
Yes, I mean, this argument that the NHS is underfunded, that had some credibility during the Cameron coalition years. In those years, it was true that even though the budget wasn't cut, I don't think it was ever cut in its entire history, but real term spending increases for a while were really quite low. It was less than 1% real term spending increase per year. But I mean, that situation is now in the past. Already before the pandemic, total healthcare spending in Britain had gone up to just over 10% of GDP, and that is above the European average. It's above the OECD average. It's a perfectly normal spending figure, if anything, slightly towards the higher end. So if the claim is that the system is just underfunded, then you would have to make the same case for the majority of healthcare systems in the developed world. But the majority of them are not experiencing the problems that we are experiencing. That's the point. It's not surprising that in the first year, say, of the pandemic, and during the worst stage of it, that waiting times for things other than COVID were going up. That happened elsewhere too. That's not a specifically British problem, but elsewhere the situation improved again afterwards, whereas here it didn't. That is the big difference. In other systems, things went back to normal again eventually once the worst was over, and here there's just no end in sight. The waiting list is, if anything, is still increasing.
But Christian, a lot of my viewers may well be of the view, you know, they've just witnessed one of the fastest vaccine rollouts in the world, for example, and they might be watching this and listening to you, Christian, right now and thinking, well, hang on a minute, the NHS has a lot of success stories to speak of over recent times.
Well, yes, the vaccine rollout, that is a success story. I wouldn't disagree with that.
Could you have done that without the NHS, though? Does that centralised system actually help? Does that centralised form of healthcare actually help when it comes to things like national rollouts, for example?
Right. Well, there we don't really see a clear pattern, because even though it's true that here the vaccine rollout has been quicker than in our neighbor countries. If you look at the best performers in the world, it was actually in Israel where they were even ahead of Britain in terms of rollout. And they have a more pluralistic system with competing healthcare providers. So it's not generally the case that nationalized state monopolies have faster rollout. I think the difference here really was that that Britain was outside of the EU's procurement system, because all the others, whatever health system they had in different countries, they could only get the vaccine doses that the EU had purchased for them, and that they were part of that system, and there couldn't be much variation. But as soon as that was sorted out, our neighbors have been catching up as well, and so it's not really that this type of healthcare system made the difference. It's fast rollout is something that can be achieved in a variety of systems.
Yeah, so if we look, imagine were it in my gift, Christian, to make you health secretary, what reforms would you actually want to see in the NHS? Because a lot of people, again, watching this may well be of the view that what you ultimately want to do, Christian, is make a free at the point of use healthcare service completely redundant.
What there would be, if I had my way, there would be no such thing as a national health service. That is correct. I would replace it with a competitive, universal private insurance system of the type that we see in the Netherlands, in Switzerland, where they still cover everybody. These are systems that where nobody can fall through the cracks. There's no uninsured population. But they don't have the problem that we have here of long waiting times, and they also have better outcomes, better healthcare outcomes across the board. Now, that isn't something that would help with the current problem. That is the kind of long-term reform that here we're talking about. Maybe in an ideal world, this would happen. If we're talking more specifically about the current problems and the backlog that we have with long waiting times, here, I think one of the problems is that in the current system, it's very difficult to combine public spending with private spending. So you either have your treatment fully on the NHS, or fully paid for by the NHS, or you go fully private and you pay for everything. I think it would make sense to have a situation where, let's say you use private healthcare, you should get some kind of refund from the NHS, because you're not using NHS care at that moment, and in that way you're saving the NHS some money. Why shouldn't you get a refund? Why shouldn't they say, for example, if you are entitled to an operation which costs, let's say, £5,000, and if it's 6,000 in the private sector, why shouldn't you be able to say, I want a private option and I want to pay just that difference, just that £1,000 extra, and take that entitlement that you have with you?
Yeah, so almost like a voucher system, Christian.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of my viewers will be very interested in that, but we're going to have to leave it there. Christian Nimitz, Head of Political Economy at the Institute of Economic Affairs, thank you very much for your time. Of course, I'm joined in the studio by the political commentator, Emma Webb. Emma, I know that Christian and you will be in complete alignment on much of this conversation, but a lot of viewers are really quite anxious about any suggestion of NHS reform, because that principle of access to free healthcare is really important, and people view it as a fundamental part of who we are as a nation. Would that be put at risk by any reform, do you think?
Well, I completely understand that, because I used to be somebody who was very tentative about those who were lobbying for NHS reform until I really had to use it. And I'm actually one of those people who has been having private GP appointments.
Right.
It's so difficult to use the NHS at the moment. Anybody who's trying to use it knows that it's a complete nightmare. And I think Christian's suggestions are really good ones. But the point that I would make to those people who are concerned is this, and that is that Christian talked about health outcomes, and we've known for a very long time that when we compare the health outcomes in the UK with the health outcomes in other countries, and forget about the US, that's an extreme example on the other side of the spectrum, and I think people fear the US model. But if you look at other similar countries, most of the developed world has free healthcare at the point of use. So if you compare health outcomes with those countries, actually the NHS performs very, very badly. The best argument for the NHS is that it doesn't put people into debt when they need to get healthcare. But the point is that now, under the circumstances, the NHS is so completely broken that actually, in my opinion, we don't have access to universal healthcare in this country. There are many people around the country who will either drop off because of the waiting times. The system is so difficult to use. As a result of COVID, so many things have gone so horribly wrong that people will be dying as a result. And not only as individuals, but people that we love, our family, our brothers, our husbands, our fathers, our children, are put at risk by this bad system. So actually, if we really do believe in universal healthcare and we want everybody in this country to have access to good, high-quality healthcare that you can get in a reasonable time period, we must have reform now, because this is literally about life and death.
Well, Emma, food for thought there that no doubt will get my viewers talking, but Emma Webb will be coming back to you shortly. Now, folks, as the political drama continues to unfold at Westminster, consumers are continuing to feel the pinch during our cost of living crisis, a generation-defining inflation rising to 9.4%. The rise has been driven by higher food and fuel, with one think tank warning that poorer households will be hit the hardest because they spend a higher proportion of their income on food and fuel. So what's the solution? Tax cuts, higher wages, or simply riding it out? Here to answer those questions is the independent economist Julian Jessup. Julian, thank you for your time. Julian, could you just briefly explain to us why inflation is so high and why my generation are really going to firstly, for the first time in our lives, experience what inflation can do?
Well, there are basically three reasons why inflation is so high. The first actually is it's almost a good news story. So the world economy recovered a lot more quickly than expected from the COVID pandemic, partly because of the success of the vaccine. So demand has been pretty strong. The second problem is a worse one, which is that there've been loads of supply shocks in the global economy. So although COVID is largely behind us, it's still been disrupting supply chains, and on top of that, of course, we've had the additional disruption from the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the knock-on effect there on energy and food prices. The third factor, though, which I actually sense is the most important and the one people talk about the least, is what central banks have been doing. Not just the Bank of England, but the central banks around the world, particularly in the US and in the Eurozone, have been printing enormous amounts of money over the last few years and keeping interest rates extremely low. So that's provided the sort of monetary fuel that's allowed prices to rise. So in terms of how do we get inflation back down again, well, look at all of those three things. I mean, first of all, the global economy is slowing. That's a bad news story in other respects, but it does mean that some of the demand pressure is coming off. Some of those supply side problems are starting to ease, and so hopefully soon, for example, we'll start getting wheat exports again from the Ukraine. But I think the most important thing is that central banks are finally waking up to the problem and starting to return interest rates towards more sensible levels and rowing back on some of that money printing they've been doing over the last few years.
Yeah, but interest rates going up, Julian, isn't that going to really hurt homeowners?
Well, I think the key point about interest rates is that they're going to remain historically very low by any sort of normal standard. So, people are worrying about the prospect of the Bank of England raising interest rates by, say, 0.5%. But they'll still be less than 2%, which is incredibly low. And if you allow for inflation, whether that's general inflation or rising house prices, then real interest rates, after allowing for inflation, are actually negative, and more recently have been falling. So I think the idea that small increases in interest rates are going to tip the economy into recession, I think is overdone. But there's another way of looking at that to say, what is the alternative? I mean, suppose that we didn't raise interest rates and we allowed inflation to get out of control. But actually, at the end of the day, everybody would be worse off because inflation will be higher. But also people with mortgages would end up worse off because interest rates eventually would have to rise further than they would otherwise have done.
Indeed. Right. Julian, we're going to have to leave it there, sadly, but that was the independent economist Julian Jessup. I thank you for that explainer. Now, folks, a ban on the use of those sunbeds could be closer than ever before after the Department of Health agreed to discuss the matter with campaigners. Sunbeds continue to be popular not just in the summer. But campaigners against them have been calling for a ban for several years now, arguing that the UV rays emitted by these beds increase the risk of melanoma, the deadliest form of skin cancer. But Gary Lippman, who's the chairman of the Sunbed Association, said there was no robust scientific evidence that demonstrated a causal relationship between responsible sunbed use by those able to tan and melanoma. So is this just another example of nanny state intervention or a necessary step to help save lives? Well, to give us her insight into this is the CEO of Melanoma UK, Gillian Nuttall. Gillian, thank you for your time. Could you just explain to us the risk that sunbeds can expose us to? Do you agree there with the idea, the suggestion that there's no evidence there, definitive evidence, to suggest that there's a relationship between sunbeds and cancer?
No, not at all. It's been acknowledged as long ago as 2009 that sunbeds are carcinogenic, and yet we see salons pop up on street corners all over the place. So we're going 13 years and we still have a big problem with sunbed use in this country. We have a problem with underage sunbed use. We have a problem with overuse of them. And it's interesting that you were speaking about NHS funds only a few moments ago. It's anticipated that non-melanoma skin cancers and melanoma skin cancers cost the NHS millions. So if we're looking to increase some funding into the NHS, a ban on sunbeds, we think, would do the trick.
So how many lives, have you got any idea how many lives you reckon would be saved by a ban on these sunbeds?
The study from Greater Manchester that was done recently, I think it was in the thousands, so a lot. But as well as melanoma, obviously we represent melanoma patients, but we also work in non-melanoma skin cancers as well. And there is a very high risk of non-melanoma skin cancer. So we're talking, on non-melanoma skin cancer, you're talking hundreds of thousands of cases are diagnosed every year. And if you look at one of our patients who's sadly no longer with us, who was a sunbed user, he was also a statistician, and he did some research into the cost of treatment of a melanoma patient from diagnosis to end of life, and it was around £500,000 to treat just one person.
Gillian, I haven't got very long with you left, but I do want to ask you, I'm really keen to ask you, do you actually think there is an argument here to say, all right, well, if an outright ban isn't going to happen, that instead people, like we do on cigarettes, packets of cigarettes, that you have a disclaimer that says, look, using this sunbed, this tanning bed, will actually potentially put you at risk of these cancers and so on and so forth. Would you advocate those sort of moves instead or not? You're absolutely of the view that an outright ban is what needs to be done.
Personally, because I work in this field and I see the devastation that this causes every day, I would love to see the outright ban. However, if that wasn't possible, and I'm grateful to Sarah Owens and to James Morris for picking this up again, because we've been at this for a long time, I would love them to be honest about the dangers. Because if you obviously you look at a cigarette packet, you look at alcohol, you know what you're getting. If you smoke, you know what you're going to get. Overconsume alcohol, you know what you're going to get. With sunbeds, however, it's glorified. It's, you see beautiful bronze slim bodies on the sides of the machines, and there are no warnings there. I think that if there are any warnings, they'll be so tiny that they're negligible. So if we didn't achieve an outright ban, we would love to see proper warnings on them so that people knew exactly what they were getting, because at the moment there aren't any warnings.
OK, perfect. Thank you very much for your time, Gillian. That was Gillian Nuttall there, the CEO of Melanoma UK. Now, well, there is one to think about, I think, ultimately, because we all like a tan, don't we? But, folks, you're watching Real Britain with me, Darren Grimes. We're going to go now and see what the weather is up to, I believe.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking wet across the north and west, but drier in the south and east. Let's take a look at the details. Scattered showers, which could be heavy at times, will move slowly eastwards across southwest England as we head through the evening. Breezy with temperatures around 18 or 19 Celsius. A fine evening to come across southeast England with plenty of sunny spells. Feeling warm and humid with temperatures up in the low to mid-20s. Often cloudy across southern Wales with outbreaks of rain moving through. The rain could be heavy at times too. Breezy with temperatures around 19 Celsius. Increasing amounts of cloud across the Midlands this evening. It should remain mostly dry, but a few showers may move in across the west later. Temperatures hovering around 21 Celsius with light winds. Rather cloudy this evening across northeast England with just the odd spot of light rain possible. This mainly falling over the higher ground. Rather humid with temperatures sat in the low 20s of Celsius. A mostly cloudy evening to come across much of southern Scotland. Outbreaks of rain will move through on a brisky southerly breeze with temperatures at 18 or 19 degrees Celsius. A cloudy evening for Northern Ireland with some heavy rain moving across the country. Rather breezy too along eastern coasts. Temperatures will range from 18 to 20 degrees Celsius. Outbreaks of rain will continue to move across the country as we head overnight, staying windy for western areas in particular. And that is how the weather is shaping up overnight into tomorrow morning.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know. The latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Hello and welcome. This is Real Britain with me, Darren Grimes, on telly, DAB and online. For the next hour, we'll be talking about the battle between Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. We'll also be talking about Donald Trump. Remember him? He might be running for presidency in 2024. And we'll get the latest on the travel chaos at the port of Dover. But first, folks, here's the news with Tamsin Roberts.
Darren, thank you. Good afternoon. It's 1 minute past 3. Here's the latest from the GB newsroom. Drivers hoping to travel through the port of Dover are facing a second day of severe delays. The port authorities expressed relief at improved levels of French border staff, but warned there is a way to go to clear the backlog. The Foreign Secretary Liz Truss said the queues were unacceptable and called on officials to build up capacity at the border. A French politician claims the delays are a result of Brexit, as officials have to run more checks than before. But Dover MP Natalie Elphick says the queues are down to the French side.
The French didn't turn up to work as they were expected to do in the numbers that were needed, and that resulted in that traffic gridlock in Dover and that traffic chaos that we saw right across Kent. So the French were responsible for the mess yesterday. I understand that they are now manning the passport controls properly at Dover, which is good news, but it will take some time yet to clear through that traffic backlog.
Rishi Sunak says he would put the UK on a crisis footing to tackle issues such as inflation if he becomes Prime Minister. Speaking in Grantham, the former Chancellor hit back at tax cuts announced by his rival Liz Truss, warning they could lead to further inflation. He also promised to tackle the NHS backlog, pledging to eliminate one-year waiting times by September 2024.
I'm the candidate in this contest who can say unequivocally the NHS will be safe in my hands. We face the worst NHS winter crisis in decades. Tackling the backlogs is the biggest public service emergency.
Meanwhile, Liz Truss is promising to review all EU laws, calling for a red tape bonfire of all legislation retained after Brexit if she becomes Prime Minister. The Tory leadership hopeful said she would implement a review by the end of next year and scrap rules which were deemed to hinder UK growth. She argues that the measures would encourage business investment, but critics warn it could lead to a weakening of workers' rights. The body of a man has been found in Essex this morning after a 21-year-old went missing on the hottest day in British history last week. Emergency services had been looking for a man who was last seen in the water on Tuesday, close to Clacton Pier. Police say formal identification of the body has not yet taken place, but efforts are being made to contact the man's family. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russia's missile strikes on the port of Odessa shows it will find ways to not uphold yesterday's grain deal. The agreement would allow the export of grain from Ukraine, which is hoped will ease global food shortages. The country currently has around 20 million tonnes available. It follows months of Russia blockading Ukraine's ports in the Black Sea. A pizza delivery driver in the United States has been praised after rescuing 5 people from a burning home. Nick Bostic was driving in Lafayette in Indiana when he saw a burning house. He managed to help 4 people leave the building before going back in to rescue a 6-year-old girl. After finding the child, the pair had to jump from a first-floor window. Incredibly, they only sustained minor injuries. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now, though, it's back to Darren.
Welcome back to Real Britain with me, Darren Grimes. Here's what's coming up over this next hour. The battle between Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss to be Prime Minister rumbles on. Rishi Sunak has said he would put the UK on a crisis footing on day one as PM. Liz Truss has shared her plan for a bonfire of EU laws retained after Brexit. We'll be speaking to Conservative councillors to see who they're backing and why. Also, we'll get a roundup of what's going on in America. US President Joe Biden has, of course, tested positive for COVID-19 and is isolating at the White House. He's reported to be doing well. And Donald Trump could be back and returning in 2024. Back here in Britain, there are queues of cars at the port of Dover. That delays for people travelling to France over the weekend are likely to increase. Authorities in Kent have declared a major incident due to the traffic, and some are blaming Brexit. What else, folks? As more checks are needed to actually pass through. That's what we're talking about for the next hour. I'd love to know your thoughts. Are you stuck in traffic in Dover, or is it having an impact on you? We'd love to get you on the show today. Tweet me at GB News or email me on gbviews@gbnews.uk. Watch us on YouTube and don't forget Facebook, folk. Loads of brilliant content on our page. Cheers very much. Now, many Conservative MPs have been quite vocal, haven't they, about who they're supporting in this leadership contest, but we haven't heard so much from Conservative councillors and mayors. With the party holding over 6,700 council seats across the United Kingdom and more powers being devolved to local administrations, surely their support matters more than ever. Well, joining me now is the Conservative councillor for Epping and Thaydon, Boys, Holly Whitbread, who's backing, I believe, Liz Truss, and Councillor Rishi Fernando, the Mayor of Ware, who was undecided. I didn't know that. An undecided Ware. Well, we've got some convincing to do. And the Conservative councillor, Aisha Cuthbert. for Shortlands and Park Langley, who is in Bromley and is backing Rishi Sunak. Aisha, can I start with you then? Why are you backing Rishi Sunak? Because a lot of my viewers are saying, I cannot imagine out worse, right? They just view him as this sort of miniature Tony Blair.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a criticism that does come across. But I think for me, really, it's my biggest fear is inflation. As a working mother, working full-time and counselor, my husband runs a business. Inflation scares me beyond all belief. And I would prefer to focus on inflation, getting inflation down before we talk about any tax cuts. And unfortunately, that's the situation we're in right now. And so that's why I'm backing Rishi.
Those remarks there. A lot of Conservative MPs are making similar arguments where they're saying, actually, you need someone who's tried and tested in the Treasury. He, of course, Rishi Sunak got us through the pandemic. The furlough scheme was overwhelmingly popular to maintain jobs and businesses. Isn't now, during a generation-defining cost of living crisis, the time for safe management of the economy through Rishi Sunak?
Well, first of all, let's say whoever wins, I will back, because ultimately I'm a Conservative and I want the Conservatives to win the next general election. But there's different ways to deal with the cost of living. And from my perspective, cutting tax is the best way to actually impact real people first, and they'll be able to see it in their pay packet. So that's why I'm going with Liz. And also it will promote growth in the UK as well. It supports business. So that's why I believe that Liz's economic vision is slightly stronger.
Yeah, and Rishi, you've heard two sides of the argument there. Do you see merits on both sides of the arguments? Are you tending to sort of sway in one direction? Are you a tax-cutting Conservative?
So that's why. So, yeah, I do see it from both sides, and that's why I'm undecided, because I think Rishi promotes a more long-term aim. He's seeing it as a more, down the road, what's going to be better in the long term. Because inflation, as has been said, is an incredible problem. And there is no real right solution, I think. There's short-term gains which have long-term impacts, or, vice versa. And I think Liz's tax-cutting promises, I agree, I'm a Conservative and I believe in low tax generating money for the economy. But I do have a worry that we don't want to push inflation up further, and borrowing to tackle that, I also have some issues with.
So, Holly, would you be OK then with seeing borrowing go up in order to actually fund tax cuts?
I think what Liz said actually is that she would do a comprehensive spend review pretty early on. So obviously there would have to be some initial borrowing, but she's going to go for that kind of smaller state model, looking at what we are spending on and looking at priorities. But one of the great things I think Liz is saying is actually looking at that COVID debt and taking it over a longer period of time as more of a war debt. And she's actually the only person that I think I've heard say that during this contest, and that's a really good idea from my point of view.
Mm-hmm. Aisha, then you've heard those arguments, you've heard what's been said there. I'm wondering, how nasty is this election going to get? Because we've got debates coming up next week. Do you actually think that you're seeing two different ideas, really, two different wings of the Conservative Party? You've got a more fiscally conservative wing, and then you've got this, well, actually, we need to be bold in this Brexit moment, this unfrozen moment where we've left the EU. It's time to actually seize the opportunities, and that means cutting taxes to actually allow businesses to go out there and seize them.
Well, I mean, in terms of what Holly said at the beginning, which is, at the end of the day, whoever wins, we'll get behind, because we are Conservatives. We want to have a Conservative government going into the next election. But what I think concerns me is, borrowing. We aren't in the same situation that we've been in for the last decade or even further in terms of interest rates. Now, interest rates are not what they used to be. They are going up. And I think in terms of borrowing to put more money into the public expenditure and to fund tax cuts probably isn't the way that I would prefer to go at this point.
So would you go as far as to say that Liz Truss is being reckless with these suggestions?
No, I don't think that. And actually, I don't like this whole blue on blue attack. And I think that's actually quite damaging for our party. I think both of them have different views on how to solve this really difficult situation. We had COVID once in a generation situation where we had to spend so much money for the Treasury, and, a public health crisis that's come out of that. And so I think both Liz and Rishi have just different ways to how to approach this very difficult economic situation we're finding ourselves in. But I think both of them are coming at it from a good point of view and good reasoning behind it. But I think just from my perspective, Rishi probably has what I would agree with in terms of an economic policy.
Aisha Cuthbert there. Rishi, the question a lot of my viewers are asking me is, why don't we just put Boris Johnson on the ballot? He'd walk it. Do you agree with that?
Look, I supported Boris when it came to the final two last time round, and I believe that Boris has been able to cut through to a vast amount of the population that other politicians simply haven't been able to. There is, a magic dust, so to speak, about Boris, and I get that. However, Boris has taken us through the pandemic. He has done an incredible job. But unfortunately, it did get to a situation where we have to move beyond, and the party is bigger than just one person. You vote, we don't have a presidential system here. You vote for the Conservative Party and the Conservative government, and that's why I think it's right that we're now having this contest.
So, Holly, a lot of my viewers are saying, well, hang on a minute, look at the choice that the Conservative Party have given the nation. Well, not even the nation, the membership of the Conservative Party. It's between Robo-Rishi on one hand and then lifeless Liz on the other. And they're saying, is this really the best that the Conservative Party can do?
I think that's unfair on both of them, actually. I think Liz has got a great backstory. Actually, the evolution in her politics, I think, is one of the things that sells her, because normal people don't kind of jump out the womb Conservative voters. So it's quite good to have someone who has evolved their politics. And actually, yeah, Rishi is slick and polished, but we do want professional people who can do the job properly. And he's been a successful chancellor during COVID, although there are kind of some debates about, the situation we're in now. I think that's probably unfair. And if you look at the diversity across the leadership contest, I mean, people like Kemi Badenoch, who were fantastic, a local MP to me in Essex, the argument she was making gives me real hope for the future of the Conservative Party.
Well, indeed, and that was one thing I noticed with the grassroots overwhelmingly, is that the surge of support behind Kemi Badenoch, were she actually on the ballot, were you able to vote for her, I think she'd have won it, to be honest.
I think she would have done very well. But, I think, again, we would be having similar arguments, because the argument is that Rishi is ready for the job. He's been big Chancellor for a number of years, and Kemi hasn't. She's been a minister, but she hasn't been Secretary of State. So she's certainly got some really exciting ideas, and hopefully that can feed through to the next government, whoever becomes Prime Minister.
Aisha, then, coming back to you, on that point of Kemi Badenoch, were you hearing in your patch that actually, there's this young, new thing with these ideas that resonate with many pro-nation Conservatives who are really quite fed up with identity politics and actually with politicians not being honest with them? And you've got Liz Truss, who was a Remainer in 2016. Now she's more Brexity than Boris. You've got Rishi Sunak, who has been the most successful socialist chancellor of this century. And the Conservative Party are crying out, aren't they, for genuine conservatism?
Well, I think what I was really pleased to see during the leadership campaign is the breadth of talent, actually, in the kind of Conservative ranks, and allowing people like Kemi Badenoch, is how I understand her surname is supposed to be pronounced. She came up kind of out of nowhere. I mean, she, as she pointed out, she was a minister, but I think she really just charmed the grassroots. And as soon as people got to know who she was, her polling kept going up, her support kept going up. And I think, one of my local MPs, Gareth Bacon, I know was a supporter of hers. And I think, if you watch in her early days as Assembly member at the GLA, she really did shine there. So really looking forward to seeing what kind of opportunities are there for Kemi in, I'm sure, the future cabinet.
Absolutely. I know a lot of my viewers definitely agree with that. Aisha, could you just sum up then, briefly, if you would, what the pitch is for Rishi? Try and convince my viewers who are somewhat sceptical about Rishi Sunak.
Well, I mean, for me, it's inflation. I think it's the scariest thing we've got on the horizon right now. We talk about tax cuts or pay rises. Actually, none of that means anything if inflation continues to rise. As homeowners, in terms of interest rates with mortgage, everything gets worse if inflation rises. So for me, it's that side of it, the economic policy, but also the fact, he did vote for Brexit. He was a Brexit supporter, so I feel like he probably would be the best person to take, our opportunities post Brexit forward. And being his background from, in business and working with large businesses, small businesses. Again, I think that's we need to encourage growth, and I think someone from a business background is probably the best to do that. And I'll just finish lastly, as a local councillor, he was a local government minister, and I know I had a couple conversations with him when he was in that role. He was very supportive of local government, which I think is very important to our country.
OK. So, Holly, briefly, if you would you set out the pitch for Liz Truss?
Yeah, I think Liz is standing on real kind of common sense, core Conservative values, from low tax to enterprise. I think she'll resonate throughout the country, not just in the south of England, but also in the red wall seats, by reaping the benefits of Brexit. And I'm really pleased that she is really fighting on that platform. I think she's got a lot of experience. But as I say, whoever wins, I'll support. But I think Liz at the moment is certainly edging it for me.
Rishi, have you been convinced?
No, I'm not. I'm still yet to be convinced. I will be watching the debate on Monday thoroughly to see how that goes. Because, as I said, I think they're both selling a Conservative vision, but one that they do vary, so I've yet to make up my mind.
It's going to be fascinating to see what happens over the coming weeks, but I thank you both very much for in studio joining me there. Holly Whitbread, Rishi Fernando and Aisha Cuthbert there at home in Bromley. Now, plenty more to come this afternoon on Real Britain. Next, we're going to be discussing your thoughts in Nottingham about who should pick our next Prime Minister. Conservative MPs, party members or the great British public. But first, let's have a look at the weather.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking wet across the north and west, but drier in the south and east. Let's take a look at the details. Scattered showers, which could be heavy at times, will move slowly eastwards across southwest England as we head through the evening. Breezy with temperatures around 18 or 19 Celsius. A fine evening to come across southeast England with plenty of sunny spells. Feeling warm and humid with temperatures up in the low to mid-20s. Often cloudy across southern Wales with outbreaks of rain moving through. The rain could be heavy at times too. Breezy with temperatures around 19 Celsius. Increasing amounts of cloud across the Midlands this evening. It should remain mostly dry, but a few showers may move in across the west later. Temperatures hovering around 21 Celsius with light winds. Rather cloudy this evening across northeast England with just the odd spot of light rain possible. This mainly falling over the higher ground. Rather humid with temperatures sat in the low 20s of Celsius. A mostly cloudy evening to come across much of southern Scotland. Outbreaks of rain will move through on a brisky southerly breeze with temperatures at 18 or 19 degrees Celsius. A cloudy evening for Northern Ireland with some heavy rain moving across the country. Rather breezy too along eastern coast. Temperatures will range from 18 to 20 degrees Celsius. Outbreaks of rain will continue to move across the country as we head overnight, staying windy for western areas in particular. And that is how the weather is shaping up overnight into tomorrow morning.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We're trying to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Join me, Darren Grimes, for Real Britain every Saturday and Sunday from 2 p.m. A news hour that comes with a trigger warning. Scorching hot opinion with prominent guests saying the unsayable and a little bit of weekend fun thrown in. Unlike other broadcasters, I won't be forgetting what the B in our name stands for. So howie in for Real Britain Saturday and Sunday from 2 p.m.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
Welcome back to Real Britain with me, Darren Grimes. It's now 3:24 and time for the most important part of the show. It's your say. Your voice is much more important than mine, folks. We've been out in Nottingham asking you who should pick our Prime Minister. Conservative MPs, their party members, or should the British public have the final say?
The wider public, right? Because I'm not keen on either of those two. So I think, you'd have a broader opinion if you went for everyone rather than just the Conservative Party.
I think it should be all of us, not just the MPs, not just the Conservative members, not just people from the Labour Party, but the people of the country, because it's for us. It's for us, it's for the future of this country. It's what's going to help us grow as a country, as a community together. We need to bring someone who's inclusive of everyone's views, everyone's thoughts, not just certain communities, certain people, but every single one, which makes Britain great like it's been.
Well, the wider public, yeah. Because I think, they're the ones who got to put up with the problems and all that,
I think we should have a say in it. It's not fair that we don't have any voting on it at all.
I reckon the public should have a say, because it's not fair just the MPs and the Prime Minister being able to speak, and it's affecting the public as well, so we should have a say in what's happening.
Well, I live in Florida, and we have a different system in Florida, but I think it should be the people, that either the Conservative people at large or just probably the members of the Conservative Party throughout the country. I don't think it should be the party. It's when I look at who they got the last time, it's not good to think who they might get this time.
I don't really think it's very fair. Should be everyone that should get an opportunity to pick it.
The people should decide. That's my personal opinion, for what it's worth.
The people should decide. It shouldn't be just up to the politicians, The vote should go to the people.
Because I reckon we'll get a better deal from the wider public. Because Conservative making that many lies.
I think it should be open to everyone. People can choose who they want it to be, so I think it should be open to the public.
The public, because we're supposed to live in a democracy, so if we're in a democratic society and the Conservative Party get the final say, then that's not a democracy, is it?
Probably just within the Conservative Party itself, whether it's MPs or the party. We voted the party in at the last election. I'm not Conservative myself, and I'd rather they not be in power at all, but that's the system. And after 5 years, then we get a chance to vote again, and hopefully we can take things forward in a more positive way.
As ever, great to hear some real British voices in the show. I'm joined here in the studio for the whole show by political commentator Emma Webb. Emma, people there basically making clear that there needs to be a general election. Do you think any future Conservative Prime Minister will have genuine accountability, I guess people were arguing there, from the British public, actually saying to them, look, we've endorsed you, you've got our backing, you can legitimately get on with cracking on with whatever it is you want to do.
Yeah, I think there's a legitimacy problem here, obviously. And when it comes to who you vote in as the next leader of the party that has already been voted in at a general election, what they're talking about there is having a general election. I think that the leadership of the Conservative Party needs to be voted on by the members of the Conservative Party, because ultimately you can't have people from all parties deciding who gets to be the leader of the Conservative Party. That would be absurd. It would also open it up to basically people who don't want the Conservative Party to be in power voting in the worst possible candidate. So obviously that would be an absurd situation. It sounds as if what people want in that vox pop there is some kind of general election. But I think that the issue is that there's a kind of toing and froing over what kind of political system we are perceived to have. That gentleman there mentioned living in Florida. Well, the US has a presidential system. They vote for the president. In the UK, we have a party system and we vote for the party. We don't vote for the leader. So there seems to be this kind of shift towards people wanting more of a say in who is the leader of the party, whereas the Prime Minister is supposed to just be the Prime Minister, the primary minister of the party that has been voted in a general election. But I think overall we're facing a legitimacy crisis anyway. I always thought that removing Boris Johnson wasn't going to solve the problem of trust within the party. And I think the fear is that anybody who takes over now will just be in a race to the ground before the next general election, and that they will suffer from legitimacy at every single turn.
Because it strikes me, Emma, that the Conservative Party has ceased to understand what it is that it actually stands for, it believes in. And I think Boris, for a lot of people, was something new, fresh. I have family members who, for the very first time, voted Conservative. Millions of people did, of course, in that 2019 general election. But have they learned the lessons of that election, do you think? Have they actually learned the lessons of why people voted overwhelmingly for Brexit, despite the fact that the establishment class told them that, you stupid bigots, you don't know what you're voting for, etc., etc. And Boris was supposed to be the antidote to that sort of thinking. That hasn't gone especially well, has it? So do you think people... We spoke earlier about people being frustrated with the lack of honesty and transparency with politicians. Are people really just crying out for the genuine article, the real deal, authenticity?
Yeah, I think that we have seen a monumental failure to grasp the opportunity and the energy from the 2019 elections. Boris, actually, if you remember at the very beginning of his premiership, definitely not so much towards the end, was a world-class political communicator. For all of his faults, communication was one of his real virtues in office. And what we have, I think, in general, and this bears out in the vox pop there, is that we have a real failure to communicate the ways in which our democracy works and why things are legitimate, and explaining the way that the system works to the majority of people. It seems that sometimes even our own MPs don't understand on both sides of the House how things work and why they are the way that they are. And so I think that one problem that we have is this failure of political communication. We missed a huge opportunity with Kemi Badenoch because she was the real article, she still is, but in the leadership race, obviously, she's now been knocked out. She really was the real deal. And actually, one problem is that when you look at the polls amongst members, the popularity was actually with Kemi. Yeah. So all of those candidates who were popular with the members have been voted out, and it's the unpopular candidates that are left that will be the ones that the members actually get to vote on. So I think that there's a disconnect as well between the members of Parliament and the members of the party. Yeah. And this is, in my opinion, seems to be indicative of this entire crisis of trust, of poor communication, and of a lack of understanding, of why our democracy functions and the way that it functions, what its purpose is. And this goes to the heart of what we mean when we talk about political integrity. Yeah, well, Emma Webb will be coming back for some more always good stuff there from Emma Webb. Now, folks, you're with GB News on telly and DAB radio. Next, we're going to be discussing the direction of the Conservative Party. You've had a little taster there, and what they stand for.
I'm going to be joined by Suzanne Evans to see what she makes of it all. But before I do that, let's have a check on the news headlines with Tamsin Roberts.
Darren, thank you. Good afternoon from the GB newsroom. It's 3:32. Drivers hoping to travel through the port of Dover are facing a second day of severe delays. The port authorities expressed relief at improved levels of French border staff, but warned there is a way to go to clear the backlog. The Foreign Secretary Liz Truss said the queues were unacceptable and called on officials to build up capacity at the border. A French politician claims the delays are a result of Brexit, as officials have to run more checks than before. Rishi Sunak says he would put the UK on a crisis footing to tackle issues such as inflation if he becomes Prime Minister. Speaking in Grantham, the former Chancellor hit back at tax cuts announced by his rival Liz Truss, warning they could lead to further inflation. He also promised to tackle the NHS backlog, pledging to eliminate one-year waiting times by September 2024. Meanwhile, Liz Truss is promising to review all EU laws, calling for a red tape bonfire of all legislation retained after Brexit if she becomes Prime Minister. The Tory leadership hopeful said she would implement a review by the end of next year and scrap rules which were deemed to hinder UK growth. She argues that the measures would encourage business investment, but critics warn it could lead to a weakening of workers' rights. President Zelensky says a missile strike which hit the port of Odessa shows that Russia will try to find ways to not implement the new grain export agreement, which was signed yesterday. The strike is not thought to have caused significant damage, but may destabilise the deal. The agreement would allow the export of grain from Ukraine, which is hoped will ease global food shortages. It follows months of Russia blockading Ukraine's ports in the Black Sea. The World Health Organization has declared monkeypox a global health emergency. Speaking in the last hour, the organisation's Director General warned the global risk for people was moderate, but in Europe it's high. Today's announcement means the WHO believes that a coordinated international response is needed and could lead to additional funding towards treatments. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Don't go anywhere. Darren will be back in just a moment.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, Matt. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
And then there were two. But it could be argued the Conservative leadership and candidates for Prime Minister Truss and Sunak are less popular among the Conservative membership and the wider general public than the other candidates who've been voted out. We've been speaking to Emma Webb earlier about Kemi Badenoch as one example. But hey-ho, what do you expect when the Conservative Parliamentary Party put Remainer Theresa May into Downing Street after Brexit? And look where that got us. It was a complete disaster, wasn't it, Emma Webb?
Absolutely it was. I think that this is... we can very easily get stuck on the minutiae of our own politics. But what we're seeing at the moment is a crisis that is across the board. It's across both political parties. It's across the whole political spectrum, not just in the UK, but also elsewhere as well. We're seeing a great realignment occurring in French politics. We're seeing a great realignment occurring in American politics. And people have often spoken about the sort of symmetry between what we've seen with Brexit and what we saw in the US with Trump, the fact that former Democrat voters, particularly blue-collar workers who used to vote for the Democrats, then voting for the Republicans, but then being very disenfranchised and disenchanted with their representation by the Conservatives. And I think for a long time people have pointed out that the Conservative Party in the UK isn't really conservative, and I think we've seen that a lot over the last couple of months, particularly even the last couple of years, this gradual erosion of any sense that the Conservative Party is firmly rooted in conservative principles.
Because I was hoping there that we would be speaking to Suzanne Evans, who was formerly of UKIP. Before that, she was a Tory councillor. Now, she's had a political journey where she has said, look, I don't think the Conservative Party speak for large pockets of small c Conservative voters, right? In that sort of scrutinite tradition, you might say.
Yeah.
Do you actually think that that argument still stands? Because the coalition that was created in 2019, where you had people in the Tory shires, the stereotypical blue wall, and then you had the red wall crumbling and parts of it going blue for the very first time, Boris created that coalition and managed to merge the two. I struggle to see how any platform offered by the current candidates for the Conservative Party leadership will be able to really be the adhesive to actually keep those two coalitions together in the future.
I completely agree, and I think that the two potential leadership candidates are not going to be able to do that in the way that, say, someone like Kemi Badenoch would have been. And I mentioned earlier that after the 2019 election, there was this historic opportunity to seize that power and that enthusiasm of those new voters for the Conservative Party. Boris Johnson said that they had lent the Conservative Party their vote, but then he squandered them having lent their vote to the Conservative Party. And I think at the time, the Conservative Party was at a crossroads. One path led to a resolving of this issue of the Great Realignment, is what it was called before COVID, before everybody forgot about that as a real issue in our politics, which is that there are just this vast swell of people in the country who feel politically homeless, myself included. And this was finally finding a channel through Boris Johnson, through Brexit, through the Conservative Party. But at some point, they veered off course and took a very different path. And I think what we're going to see now in the next general election is that the Conservative Party are going to struggle to hold on to those marginal red wall seats, partly because they don't have an inspiring leader who understands and can communicate properly with those people, with those issues, that the trust that was temporarily gained has now been eroded. So the red wall is going to be in crisis in terms of that great realignment. But we also have these old Conservative heartland seats, and we saw this very recently with the Honiton and Tiverton by-election going into Lib Dem hands. So I think the concern is actually that the Conservative Party at its core is in crisis, and that this is fundamentally an identity crisis. But I think that we need to recognise that this is part of a much bigger realignment in global politics as well, that people are trying to find ways to wrestle with and adapt to this change in the political climate, and it could take many decades to resolve.
Because one issue that really gets to me, I mean, you've got issues like free speech online through the online safety bill, that could seriously harm our right, God-given, to actually have free speech, freedom of expression. And the net zero by 2050, that's now enshrined in law, thank you, Theresa May. And actually, we've seen court cases this week where the government have lost them because of the fact that we have got this target enshrined in law. It is legally binding now, and therefore you cannot really be flexible on things like energy policy and all of these other issues, which are really hitting home for people. And this winter, Emma, is going to be really hard for people who are... the sums that you hear bandied about for average energy bills are eye-watering. And people writing into me, saying, I used to be able to fill up my car for 40 quid, now it's over 100. I cannot keep on doing that. I'm having to leave the car at home on a weekend. That's going to get worse under this net zero policy.
Yeah.
And to me, it's damn negligent for a Conservative Party that's supposed to be fiscally conservative, that's supposed to be responsible and all of the rest of it, to have just said, oh, well, do you know what? Virtue signalling matters most above all else. Let's march into this legally binding target. Let's pick a date. I don't know, 2050 sounds good. Let's do it by then. When actually, we have no idea how to achieve that without the immiseration of the working class, without making large swathes of the country both colder and poorer. And that, to me, is just unacceptable.
I couldn't possibly agree with you more. I think there are two issues here. One of them is that the Conservative Party lacks principles. It doesn't know what it's about anymore. It doesn't have the chutzpah to actually stand up for what it believes in, and it's just spinning out of control. It doesn't know which way is up and which way is down anymore. The other problem is, and you've hit on this completely, which is that there are certain things that have been almost removed from the realm of politics. So either they were removed from the realm of politics by the Blair years, by the last time that Labour was in power, that they managed to enshrine all of these things that existed beyond their term. And so those things have been like things like the quangocracy, all of these quangos that have so much unaccountable power. Precisely. And then you have all of these targets. And we saw this with COVID, and we're now seeing it with net zero. And people talk internationally, not just in the UK, because we're seeing this in the Netherlands at the moment with the farmers' protests, that they talk about the science. And it's a way of removing things from the realm of political decisions. And so people don't get to have a say over things like net zero. We never get to talk about the implications of net zero and what that actually means for people's lives. Because what it means for people's lives are devastating, and they should get to have a say on that. But instead, we have all of these things that, as I say, removed from the realm of politics, that Conservatives feel that they are somehow bound to go along with when they're not.
Emma Webb, I couldn't agree more. And tomorrow we'll be hearing from Brendan O'Neill on the Dutch farmer struggle and what they're getting up to there, because I think we're going to see similar scenes in this country, I'll tell you that. But now, folks, it's 3:45 and it's time for a look at what's happening over the pond. This week, US President Joe Biden tested positive for COVID, but it's been reported that he's doing well. Also, Donald Trump has been causing quite the stir after hinting that he may well run again in 2024. But will he or won't he? Well, joining me now to discuss this is the Deputy Editor of The Spectator, Freddie Gray. Freddie, thank you very much for your time. How's the President doing? We're not hearing anything too terrible about what the President's health is, other than that, I think actually it was pretty cruel to put him in the White House in the first place, to be honest with you, Freddie.
Yes, I mean, as for sort of his immediate health crisis, Darren, I think it doesn't sound like it's anything too bad. He did appear to announce that he had cancer, which the White House then had to walk back. But it's been said for a long time that making Joe Biden president was elder abuse. And for a long time, people sort of scorned that line of argument, saying it was, Trumpist propaganda and so on. But I met Joe Biden in February 2020, and I could tell you then that he wasn't all there upstairs. I don't say that with any glee or relish. I feel quite sorry for him. I think it's becoming increasingly obvious he's not up to the strain of being president. And as one Republican put it to me this week, no sane person thinks Joe Biden's going to stand again in 2024.
Yes, because, I mean, this week we saw he mistakenly referred to Glasgow as being part of England, and then appeared to actually suggest he had cancer, which the White House was then forced to actually come out and clarify. I mean, those sort of gaffes are not few and far between, Freddie, are they?
No, and they're getting sort of so weird they're not funny anymore. You know, I mean, there's ones that are quite funny, even though, you know, shocking, like when he arrived recently in Israel and said, I'm here to honour the Holocaust. I mean, he's just always had this ability, long before his mind started to go. He's always had an amazing ability to gaffe. He was known as the gaffe machine from Delaware when he was a senator. So he is he's someone who's now, he's got that ability to not talk very well. He actually has a speech impediment. And then you throw on top of that the fact he's in declining health. It's a bit of a joke, considering what an important job he has.
Yeah, and I really want to focus on the British perspective here, because, Freddie, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but it strikes me that actually the comments that President Biden made recently, in which he said that his background and the background of his family is Irish-American, and we have a long history, not fundamentally unlike the Palestinian people, and he basically there compares the plight of Irish Catholics with people in Palestine, the Israel-Palestine row, of course. He's parroting lines there, Freddie, basically from the Sinn Féin handbook, isn't he?
Yeah. Well, I think he is a bit. And this is very much part of Democrat. It's been a strain within the Democratic Party. It hasn't always dominated the Democratic Party when it thinks about Britain. But certainly a kind of knee-jerk anti-Britishness has existed in the Democratic Party. Has a lot of Irish links and old connections to Ireland. I think there is this instinctive revulsion, and I think Joe Biden has had it. He had it before he couldn't think properly. He has always sort of made, it's often jokey, but he's always made remarks like that. He was, it's not just him, much of his team also have a sort of knee-jerk, certainly when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, they didn't like Boris Johnson because they thought...
So, Freddie, I want to talk to you about Donald Trump, but before I do that, would you go as far as saying that Joe Biden is the most anti-British president in the White House for quite some time?
I think I'd say he's about on a par with Obama. I don't think Obama and David Cameron got on, so they were able to forge a relationship. But I think Obama didn't like Britain either.
Yeah. Well, Trump then, he has hinted, of course, he's been umming and ahhing, hasn't he? Not quite one leg in, one leg out. Do you think he will end up running again for the presidency in 2024? Because I tell you what, I'm going to be honest, when I read that statement from him recently, in which, you know, he's not actually on Twitter, Freddie, but it went round Twitter like a firestorm, in which he's calling Joe Biden Sleepy Joe and all the rest of it. I actually miss him, I'm not going to lie.
Well, I miss him as far as journalism goes. I think he made my career a lot more fun. I do slightly worry about how nuts things will go if he runs again. And I think, having spoken to quite a lot of Republicans this week, and I wrote a piece in The Spectator about it, that he is going to run again, principally because why wouldn't he? He is the clear front runner. He won 71 million votes last time. He controls all Republican fundraising. He's the force to be reckoned with in American conservative politics.
So in a word, Freddie, do you reckon he stands a good chance of winning if he does stand again?
Well, I mean, if he's facing Joe Biden with Joe Biden's current popularity, sub 30%, according to some polls in job approval, I think he has a pretty good chance of winning. The Trump movement is something that a lot of people don't understand how powerful it is.
Yeah.
You might not like it, but you have to accept the fact that it's a very, very powerful political force in American politics.
Indeed. That was the deputy editor of The Spectator there, Freddie Gray. Thank you very much for your time and your insight, as ever. Now, drivers hoping to travel through the port of Dover are facing a second day of severe delays. Foreign Secretary Liz Truss said the queues were unacceptable, blaming a lack of staffing by the French at the border. Here's what the chief executive of the port of Dover, Doug Bannister, said earlier today.
Since the UK left the European Union, we do now have border checks. Passports need to be checked, they need to be stamped, and so the police au frontière are only doing the job that they need to do right now. And it's the challenge of the increased transaction time. Now, that's why we increased the number of posts to be able to handle the overall throughput through the port. We just really need to get those posts manned. They're manned this morning. We need to see that carry on through this afternoon, through this evening, into tomorrow, and indeed for the rest of the summer.
Well, joining me for a brief chat is Simon Calder, the trade expert. I was going to call you there, Simon. Transport expert.
No.
I want to talk about the comments by the Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, there. She's saying, actually, it's nothing to do with Brexit and it's down to a lack of staffing by the French. Are the French just being a bit tight, Simon?
Well, no, I mean, this is a really serious issue, of course. I've been down at Dover. I've seen the great upset this is causing to families desperate to travel away for their holidays. It is the busiest day since 2019, and people are facing hours in queues. And the reason they are facing hours in queues is because your passport, which and you probably turned up there before if you sailed out of Dover, you kind of wave it at the French passport checks, which of course are done on this side of the channel. They wave you through. If it gets really busy, you don't even hold up the passports. They're just kind of waving you through. That's all stopped. It's an external frontier of the European Union now in Kent. As a result of that, they have to look. They have to check your passport is compliant. They have to stamp it. They have to see if you've been in the EU for more than 90 days in the last 180 days. In my case, they're quite likely to ask me if I've got enough money for my trip, if I've got a return ticket, and if I've got somewhere to stay. Those are all the rules that we asked to be applied to us. They are nothing to do with the EU introducing new rules. We said, yes, those are the rules we'd like, please. Now, that obviously has resourcing issues. The Port of Dover has done everything it can to try to get things up and running. We got off to a really bad start yesterday morning, and that's why we've had so much stress there with people getting stuck for 6-7 hours. But ultimately it's just one of those things where you've got to throw resources at it. There's limited space. It's the busiest weekend of the year, and therefore it was always going to be miserable. We just didn't know it was going to be this miserable.
Well, indeed, Simon. But I'm wondering then, why now? You know, we left the EU in 2019. Why now?
Well, that's because we didn't really take effect until 2020, and therefore it happened really. Sorry, we didn't take effect till 2021 on the New Year's Day last year. Now, we didn't have a summer last year because of Amber Plus. Do you remember, at no notice at all, the government suddenly introduced this new category, which meant that anybody who went to France would have to self-isolate for 10 days. I mean, that was later shown to be a load of old rubbish, but it wiped out the summer. Then we had the French with their Omicron overreaction over Christmas and New Year, saying keep out, so we didn't go on the skiing trips. So it's always going to be this weekend. The French made sure, well, they didn't make, I'm sure it wasn't deliberate. It did get off to a bad start, but I'm afraid these are the sorts of queues, as are the 10-mile tailbacks on the A20 and the M20, that you're going to have to get used to, because they are an inevitable consequence of Brexit.
OK, well, Simon, we're going to leave it there. But Simon Calder, the travel editor at The Independent, I thank you very much for your time and your expertise. Now, folks, you have been watching Real Britain with me, Darren Grimes. Thank you very much for your company. The show's on every Saturday and Sunday at 2 o'clock. And thank you, of course, to Emma Webb, who's joined me in the studio. But for now, folks, I'm going to leave you with the weather.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking wet across the north and west, but drier in the south and east. Let's take a look at the details. Scattered showers, which could be heavy at times, will move slowly eastwards across southwest England as we head through the evening. Breezy with temperatures around 18 or 19 Celsius. A fine evening to come across southeast England with plenty of sunny spells. Feeling warm and humid with temperatures up in the low to mid-20s. Often cloudy across southern Wales with outbreaks of rain moving through. The rain could be heavy at times too. Breezy with temperatures around 19 Celsius. Increasing amounts of cloud across the Midlands this evening. It should remain mostly dry, but a few showers may move in across the west later. Temperatures hovering around 21 Celsius with light winds. Rather cloudy this evening across northeast England with just the odd spot of light rain possible. This mainly falling over the higher ground. Rather humid with temperatures sat in the low 20s of Celsius. A mostly cloudy evening to come across much of southern Scotland. Outbreaks of rain will move through on a brisky southerly breeze with temperatures at 18 or 19 degrees Celsius. A cloudy evening for Northern Ireland with some heavy